Welcome back to the Subvert. I'm Alex Knight. I am joined by Aaron Stewart.
Heyo.
Hey, and Kristin Rumohr.
Hi, everybody.
And as we like to say, welcome to the land of no easy answers. There are no easy answers on this show. And our motto is, the world is more connected than ever. We are more connected than ever now with the internet, with social networks, and somehow, with all of that technology to bring us closer together, we're farther apart than we've ever been. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that today, because the topic for today is about our jobs. It's about how we define our personal identity with our jobs. This is a fascinating topic.
I mean, we're talking about whether your job should define you, right? And a little bit further than that, about our culture in general and how we've created this idea that it's about what you do that makes you who you are, right? And if that can be beneficial, if that can be harmful in terms of your personal identity. And really, I mean, when you meet someone for the first time, that's usually one of the first questions, if not the first question that people ask, is, what do you do?
Yeah.
Mine's usually, do you read books? But second to that is.
That's great. But again, what does it matter, right? And we start defining people straight away based on this answer, right? So before you know who this person is, you know, their response to what they do automatically slots them into a category. For most of us,
and that's why
anyway.
we ask that question, is so that we can slot them into that category. That's kind of specifically, you know, when we're having, you know, when we're meeting somebody, that's what that question is for, is so that we can start to figure out where we are in their hierarchy and vice versa, right?
Yeah.
And do we think that's fair?
Let's let me just talk about this. Give a bit of history here. I'm just gonna.
I just jumped right into that there.
Yeah, that's totally cool. No, I want to talk about this. I just want to talk about this BBC article here, because this was the article that I think one of you guys posted here, and it talks about today our jobs don't dictate our names, but they still often become a major part of our identities. And they talk about, after all, one of the first questions we tend to exchange with new acquaintances, what do you do? And you guys just said that, right? That comes up all the time when you're at a party. What do you do for work, right? And in many ways, it feels natural to see a person's profession as a defining detail of who they are, right? It can be a clue into their values, interests, could be a clue into their background, right? But there are many of us that define ourselves by our occupations. And sometimes that comes at our own expense, right? I mean, I've experienced that before. I've been so wrapped up in who I am and what I do for a living that when suddenly that job is taken away from you for whatever reason, so that can be a pretty crushing thing, especially when you spend time out of work doing work, right? I mean, have you guys ever experienced this? Or are you very much a, you know, punch in at this time, punch out, and I don't, you know, my job is my job, but, you know, I don't let that define me? Or is that very much a part of your own identity?
I used to be a lot worse with it. Like I used to take work home with me, for sure, and all hours, right? Like if emails are coming in, doing work on the side. And it's a fairly new thing in the last couple of years where I had to step back and stop to, you know, why am I letting this take over my life? This is becoming who I am.
Yeah.
Right. And this goes back to, again, kind of the age of internet and digital communication and constant availability. Right. So I had to step back and say, no, it's okay to set office hours. Right. It's okay to say these are my work times and to turn it off at whatever time I've decided and walk away. That doesn't make me a bad person. That doesn't make me lazy. And that's a big thing now as well. If you're not constantly working, you're labeled as, you know, you're lazy. You're not working hard enough.
Yeah. What are you doing with yourself?
Yeah, exactly. How dare you have a life and free time?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because historically, most people didn't get to choose their own jobs, right? I mean, if you're, maybe your grandfather was a cop, and your father was a cop, and then you became a cop or a surgeon or whatever have you, the job is. That's kind of how it used to be, but lately,
but I mean, think about it. That's back in the day when, if you were named Smith, it was because you were a blacksmith.
Right.
Right. And that's kind of a throwback to that kind of mentality, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily, like, how many Smiths do you know, like John Smiths, who are actual Smiths, right? I mean, it's just not how this works anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So it's tough to say that, you're defined by your job or the job defines you. It's more you get to choose now, right? Versus your name defining you and you having to do I'm sure your parents would love you to do what they do, but
yeah. Well, I mean,
my parents would love me to do a lot of things.
Yeah. But they've done studies of, like they went to the Volkswagen plants in Germany where they've had, generational workers who have been at these factories, right? And they found that a lot of the efficiency comes from grandpa passing down tips to grandson, right? And that's how a lot of the information that made the factory run smoother got passed down, right? So in a lot of ways, having that generational knowledge does actually help us, and the fact that here in kind of the northern or our hemisphere here, where we don't really value our elders as we should, right? As I'm heading towards eldership, maybe I just feel like it should be valued more, right? But it's just one of those things where they have knowledge that I think we're not taking advantage of,
Well, I mean, jobs have become, like the article talks about here, the jobs have become a significant marker of identity in more nuanced ways. So, for example, this is good. They say when someone says they're a surgeon, you generally assume they have strong education and high income, right? Two metrics that can you would hope. Two metrics that can determine one's standing in society, and that can affect how you subsequently judge that person, right?
Well, I mean, I would judge them more harshly if I heard, I'm a surgeon. I took a couple of online courses. I'm like totally a surgeon now.
I'm self-taught.
Right? Like, yeah, exactly. Right? Like that I would judge more harshly for sure. Right?
I mean, I'd admire that, but would I go to that surgeon?
Well, and I don't know if I'd admire it as much as question it. How many surgeries have you done and how many of them were successful?
But you bring up a good point there, Alex, because that does indicate a certain standing in society, right? Certain jobs. And I'm sure everyone listening can probably identify with this is, as a kid, your parents are pushing you to, why don't you become a lawyer or a doctor, right? It's always these two things for the most part, right? And it's because they indicate social status.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, they're necessary jobs as well. Don't get me wrong. Of course they are. But I think it goes back to that. It's you will now be perceived as being wealthier, right? Being higher up in the social hierarchy.
Well, and that's, as a parent, if your kid's a doctor, you get the rub off, dignity or whatever, I guess, associated with that, right? Like your standing becomes a little higher because your kids have gotten higher than where you were. Hey?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that's where, like I had heard earlier on that you generally change jobs 7 or 8 times over your life. So for me, defining myself by my career has always been one of those things that I just kind of decided not to do early on. So I've done all sorts of different careers, right? Where, I sold computers for a while. I serviced computers. I've done all sorts of different, right? Like I've been a metal worker. I welded for a little while. I've done miscellaneous things over the course of just to try out different things and basically try to make myself a more well-rounded person versus becoming a more well-rounded worker. Right?
I talked about how, blurring the lines between work and personal life can have their downside. So one of the things that I guess the question I wanted to put forward here is letting work be so tied up with your personal identity. Is that necessarily a bad thing, or are there exceptions? Are there times where that that's okay, right?
I think that's for everyone to decide for themselves, really, right? Or for those around them to help them to decide with, right? I mean, everybody kind of knows when they're pushing themselves too hard. We like to tell ourselves that we're not, right? And that's the problem with our world, is that, you know, it's because our identity is so tied up in our job and everything, we have to keep that job or else our identity becomes questioned. Right? So, you know, if it requires, you know, the Saturdays to come in and not get paid for, or the extra hours overtime where you're not getting paid for, or the 2 hours of commute that you do just because that's what you do, right? You know, it's we make justifications for all these things that aren't necessarily part of the job, right?
Yeah. Have you guys heard of the enmeshment trap?
Explain it to us.
I believe I read something a lot about it, but
yeah. Well, okay, it's basically a fancy word for explaining what we just talked about, is where the boundaries between work and personal life are blurred. So, for example, like common signs are you're thinking about work whenever you aren't there. You're bringing up your job within the first 3 minutes of a conversation with someone. You know, it's just like you don't have any space for hobbies, for other interests. It makes it harder for you to connect with people who aren't working, you know, like who aren't part of your working life. And that's not exactly a healthy thing either. And I'm sure Kristin is, you know, as someone who deals with mental health issues in your profession, I'm sure this is not a new thing to you. You see this all the time with people.
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, is that her profession as a podcast host, dealing with our mental issues? Or I was a little stuck there. I thought you were looking right at me when you were saying that. So sorry.
You're projecting.
Oh, so that's not enmeshing. Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
Sorry, I broke it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you're tying your self-worth to your career, the successes and failures you experience directly affect your self-worth, right?
In a lot of cases, your job wants you to tie those two together.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Right?
Like there is pressure.
Yeah, exactly. They want you to,
and that's what we were saying earlier. Always be available.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like I'm in a situation now where I'm now moved on from what I was doing, and now I've got the benefit of looking back at that and kind of going, you know, to move up to where I was trying to move to would have meant the extra hours, would have meant the overtime, would have meant the having to give up my free time of my being able to shut stuff off at 3:00 or whenever I was done. It would have required me to have continued that thought, you know, would have been a deeper enmeshment of this whole thing. Right. So this whole talk we're having right now is great because it really just ties into exactly what's going through my life right now, where I'm now in this change of identity, going through changing jobs and trying to find a new way of kind of identifying me, you know, and who I am and what I do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's been fun.
It's an opportunity not really given to a lot of people, right? Like to find that time to find yourself and what you enjoy. And I think this kind of workaholic culture that we have ties into what we've talked about in a lot of past episodes, is just kind of this numbing effect that we've created, right? Is hiding from your true self, hiding from asking the questions, who am I? What do I want out of life? Because if you're constantly working, then it doesn't matter, right? You suddenly have fulfillment.
Yeah, exactly. And fulfillment. You know, what would actually make me feel like an actual human being instead of just a worker for this company that realistically probably doesn't really give much of a fuck about me, right? realistically, to the company, if I become a liability, they'll quickly push me aside. You know, regardless of how much time or effort or whatever I put into this company, at that point it becomes irrelevant because the company has needs, right? And unfortunately, the company's needs always seem to outweigh the employees' needs, which was a fun little wake up call to have, right? And that was, again, part of that where I felt I needed to program myself to be flexible, to be able to roll with things and to be able to, you know, when these hits come, try to figure out whether the lesson to be learned was that I didn't want to be doing that anymore.
Yeah.
You know, I invested a bunch of time in computers. I spent 10 years learning about computers, getting myself up to speed, learning all these, you know, keeping up with all the new things that were coming out. And then I got to the end of it and I went, whoa. Right. And I went completely Luddite for about 2 years where I didn't have a computer. I barely, like, the phone was like the oldest flip phone I could get a hold of. I completely just shut it down because it was just, you know, just that constant, just having to keep up on stuff. I couldn't leave work without having to read up articles and new things and new developments, and stuff was always coming. And right. And it just became where, you know, like, I've lost all the hair up here just because, you know, like, brain cycles just started pushing it out, you know?
Yeah.
And I feel that a lot of us get stuck in that trap.
Of course, you know? We do. Of course. I mean, I've experienced this where, you know, it's depending on the individual. I mean, your coping strategies will vary, right? So, like, at some point, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when something is going to happen, right? Whether there's a recession, layoffs, your company's acquired, your job isn't what it used to be. That's going to happen at some point, right? And it can be shattering. I've definitely gone through periods of very difficult, like, it's very difficult to deal with that if your whole life is wrapped up in what you do on a day-to-day basis for work, right?
Even if it's not, right? I mean, just think about you, like, anybody that's ever lost a job, the next day when one of your friends turns to you and goes, so what are you going to do? Right? And you have to actually just, like, look them in the eyes and go, I don't know. Right? Like, you know, it's devastating for anybody that's been through it, right? Like, and regardless of the situation that caused it, I mean, to have to really look at yourself in the mirror and go, what am I going to do now? Right? Like, yeah, there's just no time that's, you know, a easy conversation for anybody to be having with themselves. You know?
Do you think we should be preparing people differently or children differently, right? Absolutely. Instead of our education system is so geared to what are you going to do?
Yep.
Maybe we should be, you know, teaching who are you going to be? Not what are you going to do? Who are you going to be? What makes you you? Right.
Well, then I think that's kind of the part of the trap too, right? Is you know, that's wrapping your identity into what you're doing, right? Instead of who you are.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's kind of the part that we need to start to separate our jobs from who we are.
Absolutely. That's
right. Like, that doesn't define who I am. I am a person who does all sorts of things completely separate from the job that I perform today. Right. Today I'm a carpenter. Tomorrow, who knows what I could be. Right.
Yeah.
And that's where I think it's more a matter of preparing ourselves to just be. Right. Like, if that's the job that you're doing today, give it everything you've got. Right. Do whatever you need to do to get yourself to be the pinnacle of whatever you're doing, just because that's fulfilling for you. And it doesn't matter what anyone else is doing. You don't need to be better than them. Just be the best you can be.
Right.
Right. Because
Yeah.
I think that removes a lot of the ambient frustration and nervousness and stress around a lot of this, because you don't have to worry about doing it for them. Yeah. You're not doing it for this company. You're not doing it for anything else but you. Right.
That's it. A job is just a job.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And I'll credit my mother to this, because she did say that from when I was a kid. And she was, you know, she said, Kristin, she's like, you can always make money, right? It's just the meaning we attach to different job titles. But there's nothing wrong with, if you're broke, sometimes you might need to scrub toilets, you know? And that's okay. But that's not who you are as a person. That's just what you do to make money. And we all just have to, get on with it, right? It doesn't define who we are. You do that for a while if you need to, and then you find something else. And, if we can kind of transition easier between these, different walks of life, then maybe we'd be a little bit more, I just completely lost my train of thought.
No, that's okay.
Anyways, someone pick that up.
On that note, too, in the BBC article here, Ann Wilson, this professor, is saying that doing work you love is not necessarily a bad thing, nor is considering what you do for a living an important part of who you are. But she's saying that we need to move away from a system where people are defined primarily or exclusively by their jobs, right? And she's saying that it'll take more than realizing that there is a problem or reprioritizing in the wake of the pandemic. It will also require a cultural shift away from the idea that each person has a professional, quote unquote, calling dictated by who they are, and that the goal of life should be to discover it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's
a very kind of elitist standpoint, in my opinion, isn't
Absolutely.
it? Right? That indicates that you come from a comfortable enough background.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very old way of thinking. This is how, we raise people, and then they have kids, and then they grow up, and then they raise their kids with the same exact values, and we're just perpetuating this, like this is how it should be.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of, I think that a lot of that, like you're talking about in the elitist viewpoint of having the option, right? And I just feel like we're at the point now where we should be able to, where everybody should have that option, right? I have this problem lately where, you look out into the world and all these people facing losing their jobs, and I just go, but, they can't just go back to school. And that's the problem, is that they actually just can't go back to school, right? Like, and it's the cost associated and all this.
Putting yourself tens of thousands into debt.
And that's exactly the problem, right? Like, so I understand that, when you're put into this situation and you have no, nothing underneath you to support, right? That's extra devastating. You've not only just lost your job, your livelihood, and now all of your, right, like everything else could disappear as well. Oh, crap, right? And that's where I think that, a lot of this comes down to, because our job situations are going to be more tenuous as they go forward, we need to start putting those programs in place so that people have these supports, so that when your job falls out from underneath you, it's not completely going to ruin everything. You're still going to have a means to be able to either retrain in something else or move yourself, or you've already kind of started that retraining because you kind of went, well, is this really what I want to do? Maybe I'll take some extra courses, right? Luckily they were free, so you could do that extra training on the side to get yourself into a different position versus what you're having to do now to pay the bills, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think a lot of it is just the problem of, if you don't have any other options, then you have to tie yourself tighter. Right. I look at a lot of like the guys who have been in the oil rigs for 30 years, 40 years. Right. And what are they going to do when this all falls down?
Yeah.
Right. Like, and if they don't have an option to retrain them, well, now I can understand why they're getting so upset about this, right? Like, no, fuck you, that's my job, right? Like, of course, right? But, a lot of this is unfortunately in the category of going away.
Kristin, what would you suggest to somebody that is complete, like their work life is so enmeshed in their personal identity, and they, as a grown adult, they, as I suppose many people do, have challenges finding friends. They have challenges finding things outside of work. They don't have time. They don't do anything else. Like, how do you transition from someone who's just like, it's all about, my whole life is about work? What would you suggest to that person? What's the first step?
Mm-hmm. It's a tough one, because if it's tied into your personal identity, it's not as easy as, just shut it off, right? So it's just kind of picking out little threads here and there to start with, right? What do you enjoy doing? Mm-hmm. And kind of just to keep prompting that response. So if it's all work related, it's like, okay, and what else? And what else? Right? Until you can pick out little bits that have nothing to do with the profession, and just kind of building on that, right? You start off small always, right? You don't want to overwhelm any person if they're trying to, separate job and identity, and take that one thing like, oh, I enjoy watching the birds outside my window. First thing that came to mind, right? Then, okay, spend time doing that. And I find the more you just start focusing on the things you actually enjoy that are good for you, the more you start wanting naturally to build on those things. Right.
And it's funny because I was thinking about it, and like usually the second question I ask people after the, what books you read question is like, what do you do in your free time? Right. Because, I try to move past what you do for work and try to figure out, and then the third question is usually, so if you had the option of leaving your work, right, would you go and do that?
Right.
And just, that doesn't make me very popular at parties, but.
Aaron, do you have any suggestions for anyone? I'm sure you've gone through this before, but like, what do you try to do outside of work? Right? Like, how do you balance your time? Like, what do you do? Is it reading a book? Is it just watching a movie? Like, how do you separate that? Do you just shut everything off and not answer emails, not answer, I don't know how you go about that.
Yeah. Basically, that's kind of what it's a matter of discipline, right? If you're going to, especially if it's something that's worth doing, right? Like I used to do like the musicals, right? And when you walk into, onto stage, everything else has to go away. Right. So, I mean, I'm kind of trained to be able to do that, to be able to just kind of wipe my brain clean and go, okay, what situation am I walking into here? Who do I have to be to fulfill this? Right. So, I mean, it's a little different for me because I've kind of, spent a lot of time putting myself into other people's shoes. But I think that's a good start for it. Right. Is just kind of picture yourself as someone else. And if you were looking at yourself going through this, would you feel pity for that person? Right. And, what advice would you give to that person? And just try to separate the emotional content of you having to go through this. Right. And just look at it from a subjective perspective, maybe. Does that make any sense, Kristin? Or right. And then, just run that scenario through your head and just say, if I were to want to do something else, what would I want to do and how would I get to there? Right. Yeah. So again, like if you're going to do these separate things, like you said, you have to have the distractions separate. Like as with any of this stuff, like we come to this and we shut off our phones. We make sure that everything's, quiet in the setting so that we can focus on this. Right. And it's the same thing with, if you're going to learn a new language, you can't do it with, stuff running in the background. It's like any of it.
Yeah. And discipline's a good one too. You do have to be disciplined to kind of unlearn a lot of this stuff that they built up in our minds to be important, right? So to unlearn that, we have to make that hard choice, right? And you do have to make that call to say, okay, I dedicate this amount of time, even if it's, 5 minutes, right? You owe that to yourself to, okay, for these 5 minutes, I will not check the emails. I will not be thinking about work or that deadline or what, I'm just going to sit and read this book or do some yoga or cook something or whatever it is that you've decided and stick to it, right?
Yeah. And that's the other part of that is the discipline of small chunks to start. Right? Like you don't want to start with you don't want to start with, this is where I'm going to be. You have to break it down into smaller bits, right? Because it's not going to be
all or nothing culture. Hey,
tell me about it.
Exactly. Actually, there was a good, I don't know if it was that article or one of the other ones that we're talking about next episode, but they talked about how the world isn't bipolar, it's dimensional.
Yes.
Which I thought was a great way of putting it.
Great way of describing it.
Right? Nothing around us is yes or no. Never. Like literally, like even your switch is kind of a, right? Like it's off and on, but there's some ambiguity in between, right? Like all of it has some level of gray. And that's the part that we seem to, we want to break stuff down so it's simple for our brains because otherwise, all of this is just too much. But that's the whole thing that we need to start getting past, is to start seeing those dimensions of, and that's where, the putting yourself into this other situation, you need to really be able to brainstorm and really think about, like, the things that you do in your free time that you enjoy doing. Right. And so that's where I try to put people in that other situation. Don't think about what you're doing now, because a lot of that is a limiting expression of what you think you're supposed to be versus what you actually are. Right. Like, this is what you do now. Right. Versus what you would do if you had full choice and full, of whatever you could do.
You just brought up a really interesting statement I want to kind of go back to, is this "who am I supposed to be" statement. Right. I think that's a really prevalent statement most people think is, who am I supposed to be? How am I supposed to appear? Right? What will give me the most acceptance by acting a certain way or appearing a certain way? Right? And how do we go from flipping that narrative to, it doesn't matter what you look like or what you do. It's important. We need to value people just valuing themselves.
Yeah. I just wanted to add something too. If you feel like just remember, no matter how bad you feel about the job that you are doing right now, if you're not happy, and this has helped me, maybe this will help somebody else too. But, if you're not really happy in the job that you're doing, what I've found that has helped, or maybe you just feel like it's not the right job or the job you should be doing right now. It's not the ideal job. I just find throwing myself into that job to, like, I'm just going to, whatever it is, I'm going to do the best. I'm going to be the best at this particular role or this particular, whatever it is that I'm doing. Just try to be the absolute best. I just find, for me, that actually helps. I don't know why, but it does. Aaron, let's do a little role play, okay? I'm going to be your boss. I'm going to call you after hours. You're going to pick up the phone, okay?
No.
Yeah, you're going to pick up the phone.
I'm not going to, actually.
It's after hours. His phone is off.
That's exactly right. Like, that's exactly the thing, right? Like, at a certain time,
Aaron's
like,
triggered here.
Don't answer the phone. No, I mean, that's not even a trigger thing. It's again, like, it's more just that there has to be those kind of, like,
sure.
I think there's actually a law in France where your boss can't call you after a certain time, like, cannot call you.
That's how it should be.
And that, really, why not? I don't understand how, I mean, if there's something that's, I can't even think of a thing that would be dead. Like, if you're going to the hospital and it's an emergency, sure. Right. Like, let me know. Right. I'm going to have to run things tomorrow. Okay, cool. Let me know.
Aaron,
other than that, there's nothing important enough.
This is your boss. You need to come back into the office. There's some unfinished business here.
You can keep trying. It's not going to work. I'm well beyond that now.
I thought you were.
I'm calling myself a reformed employee.
I thought you were a team player. Are you not a team player?
No, absolutely. At this, no. I mean, my problem is that my team was always bigger than they thought it was. They thought that it was just supposed to be the team of this company that I was working for, but in reality, I worked for Team Humanity, and unfortunately, Team Humanity has different rules than Team Company. So that's kind of been my problem in the work world in general, was that they'd always say that, oh, this is absolutely necessary for you to do, and I'd go, is it? Is it really that necessary? Like, are you sure? Yeah. I never had a good answer for that.
I think I've said everything that I want to say on this. Do either of you have any other closing arguments about personal identity and jobs? Anyone want to share any stories? Let's get uncomfortable before we leave people here for the week. It's okay if you don't want to. That's fine.
Who's got the worst firing story? You guys ever been fired before?
Oh, of course.
I actually haven't.
The very first job I got from right out of high school. No, I was still in high school. I think I was 17. I want to say 17. I got a job at I'm not even going to mention the name of the company, a certain large franchise that makes sandwiches. And I just didn't really care about the job. So one of the requirements of the job was memorizing the various sandwich options on the menu, memorizing what ingredients were in them. So if somebody asked, I could tell them what it had. Well, I didn't bother doing that, and this really, really irritated the owner. And then on top of that, I was squishing sandwiches as I was cutting them, and she was like, "You don't know how to work the knife. You're squishing the sandwiches." She's just like, this isn't working out. I think I lasted 30 days.
Yeah, I was gonna say that was I think about my shortest gig too. Yeah. I was working for a fire protection company, and my last day he had me installing an exit sign from the ceiling, and the screwdriver that I had, the little ball bearing that holds the bit in place, was gone. So I had it up in the air and it was hanging off of the wires, and then I got zapped, which caused my arm to twitch, which caused the bit to fly out of my screwdriver and fly across the room. So I'm standing on the top of this ladder with this sign going, right? And it's not tied together enough that I can let it go because it's just going to drop, but it's still mostly tied together, so I can't let it go.
Great.
So,
that's awesome.
So that was loads of fun. At the end of that day, the boss was just like, this just isn't going to work. And I went, fair enough.
So it's always the same answer, isn't it? This isn't going to work.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was one of those, hey, what about this? Why don't I try something like this? And no, that one didn't work.
Apparently, Kristin has never been fired. She's too perfect.
I would not go that far. I've had some like mutual leaving conversations.
You're leaving, right? Yeah, I'm leaving. Oh, okay, cool.
Just like, I feel like you don't want to be here. That's true. Yeah.
Is that because I wrote "I don't want to be here" on the wall? Or
Not an all-out firing, although that is one of my goals. I would like to actually be spectacularly fired from one job.
Yeah. You know what? Nothing says we don't want you here anymore when they start the hiring process to basically replace you, and then you find out that they are going to offer that person a higher salary than you are, even though you're technically going to be above them in terms of, like, that's always insulting, I find.
Yeah, and that's the problem with this whole corporate hierarchy thing too.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah. Like, I always found that interesting, where you would think that my raises would keep up with that. Hey,
Mm-hmm. I can't. Right? It doesn't work for me. Like, I can't be in a position that's above somebody and make less than that person.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, now there's a question for you, right? And this is one that we can throw out into the general audience. Is like, I know most companies don't want you to talk about your wage, especially with other people.
Sure.
Right. And to me, that always just seemed like it only helped the company.
Well, yeah, of course.
Right. Because then we can't coordinate our wages and say, hey, wait a minute, right? Why are you paying them? Right. And I mean, I get that it breeds a certain amount of, psychological warfare within the company, right?
Well,
but is that, so like throwing that out to the people out there, do you feel that it's worth your company being able to say that to you?
Good question.
Or do you feel like that's not something that they should have the right to impose?
Yeah, I worked at, it's something that has been experimental, I know, with a lot of, not a lot, but some tech companies I know, and the names escape me, where they started moving to a culture of just being completely transparent and open. Like, everybody knows everyone else's salary.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And you could argue that there are benefits having that transparency, that there's not this stigma with salary of like, ooh, I wonder what that person's making. Are they making more than me? Right. But where it doesn't work, and I worked at this one company, and it was done, we were a small team of 10 people. And the owner of the company, who was very much involved with the day-to-day stuff, just decided one day that he was just going to divulge people's salaries and say what he was hiring this person at. And I was upset. I had a private conversation. I'm like, there was no prior discussion about doing this, and now you're just going and telling other people what I'm making too. And he actually apologized, and he said, you know what, I didn't actually think that would be a problem.
Were you one of the upper mucky mucks in that company, or?
No, not at all. I mean, I had a very specific job to do, but I wasn't a manager or anything like that. So, but it did bother me because when you go, you can't just go from a culture that's known to be, we don't divulge salaries, to one day just saying like, oh, here's what everyone makes on a piece of paper and everyone can see it. It's like, but you didn't ask my permission if that was okay. Right? Am I wrong? Like, do you think it's like, how would you feel if if your boss just decided to basically put a Post-it note on the door with everyone's salaries without even asking, why not have, this is the way I would have done it. Let's have a meeting. This is what I'm thinking of doing. I want to move us to a culture where we're more transparent and open. I want to remove the stigma salaries. Would everyone be okay if this information was publicly available? Mm-hmm. Right? But that didn't happen.
That's the thing. I mean, like, it was the company's decision to make in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
But if you were hired in under that clause that it wasn't going to be public information, then it's kind of the same as disclosing any other type of personal information, isn't it? Right?
Well,
like it's salary, but
no, I mean,
if you're hired under the premise of no one else is going to know.
Well, it's kind of an unwritten rule. There's nothing in the employee contract that says we won't tell people what you make, but it's kind of a etiquette thing that you just don't go around telling people what you make. So to suddenly,
and I was in the completely opposite mindset of that. Where
really?
I was absolutely all about telling people what I made, right? Like I had no problem because, again, I felt like it was empowering as an employee to be able to know that everyone around me is in the same boat and we're all working towards the same, right? Like
I side with Aaron on this one too. I think that's what gives people more power as well, right? Because the company, the overarching company, holds all the power by keeping all of this secret, right? And they don't want you talking to each other because if you start talking to each other, you realize
I just felt like it was a big part of also my own insecurities too, because it also came down to the person that we were going to hire for that position was going to be offered a salary that was higher than mine, and they were in a position below me, and that was not cool.
That was the case.
But that's the thing, but that's because they offered that transparency. Did they give you the option to go and renegotiate after it?
No.
And that's a problem, right? Like if you're going to offer that transparency, you have to understand that people might have questions, right? And if you're not willing to renegotiate,
no kidding,
with your employees about this, then that's a different story, right? It's one thing to change the transparency in and out, but it's another to not let your employees act on that information. That was my problem with this whole because that's why I felt like they were keeping it from you in the first place, was so that you can't act on that information. Right. But the problem is that as an employee, I should be able to act on that information. That should be my right.
Sure. Of course, right? You have every right. I mean, you have every right to ask for more money at that point. Yep. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Or to move on if you're not going to negotiate with. Right. And that was always my thing also with a lot of these companies, was you get to the end of a year and they would negotiate, or they would come to the I guess, what am I looking for? Word I'm looking for, evaluation period, right? Where they would evaluate you, but there was never a point where I was evaluating the company to say what I felt the company could do better with regards to working around us.
I think there's good organizations always make it a two-way street for feedback to, and I've been at companies where they do something called the 360 review, where you're not just being reviewed by your manager, but you're also reviewing your manager. It goes two ways. It's like your manager can't get better at their job if they don't know what's bothering you. So they have to be willing. They have to be willing to sit down and have a conversation about, well, what is it that you like and don't like? What is it like? Let's work together. Let's keep the communications lines open. That to me is what makes a good organization work properly. Otherwise, you start to have like these toxic work environments where it's like nobody, you feel like you're walking on eggshells. Nobody wants to talk to each other. And that's just, you can't solve any problems that way.
And when you bring something up, you get met with, you're lucky to have a job.
Yeah. Yeah,
You know?
exactly.
I've been met with that argument before, actually, in terms of salary and what you went through, Alex, as well, having a new employee start that's offered a higher salary than you're on. And I do challenge these things, of course. And I was met with this at one particular place that was, well, in order to attract new recruits, we need to offer this salary.
Okay, well, do you want to keep me?
Now I feel devalued.
Yeah.
So I should be offered the same. And,
absolutely.
oh, well, you know, because you're already here and this was the contract. And so I quit, obviously, straight away. Yeah. But that's not, you know, a unique story by any means. No, a lot of people go through it and they get guilted as well. You're lucky to just have a job.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a culture that should change as well. Yeah. No, it's you're lucky that you have people wanting to work for you, right?
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Unless you're the owner here, like, you know, we are making money for this business.
Yep.
Right? You know, we don't have to.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I ran a construction company for 3 months, right? I owned a company.
Oh, did you?
Right, like, and that was always my thing. Like every Friday I made a point of buying them lunches, like going out and making sure that they had some drinks after work, making sure that they knew I appreciated they showed up. Mm-hmm. Right. And that was a big point of what I was trying to get at with this whole thing was that, you know, like every day I was just like, thank you for being here. Right. Like this could not happen without you. Mm-hmm. You know, and I just felt like, you know, I'd go into any of these other companies and it just never had that feeling, right? Where, like you said, it was you're lucky to have a job. And I'd go, no, you're fucking lucky I'm here, right? Like I'm not just some schmo coming here to fill some boots for you, right? Like,
well,
I'm here because I'm good at my job.
Yeah.
You know?
An organization is only as good as the people that are in it, right? So that respect has to flow. The respect has to flow both ways, right? So, I mean, because, hiring is a very difficult thing. And there's always risk involved because you never know how that person's going to work out. They may interview well. Everything on paper may look good. But until they really get in there, thrown into the fire, you know, after a few months, you start to see what that person's really going to be like. I will say, we're running out of time, but I will say one thing. And, you know, one of the best decisions I made during the interview process is, and I encourage everyone, like, you know, to make sure you get what you want, don't be afraid to, during the negotiation, to make sure stuff gets put in writing so you can't get screwed, basically. You know, like one job they did not want to offer me the salary that I needed. It wasn't like they weren't lowballing me, but it was a little bit less than what I wanted. But I started looking for other ways to make this work, to get what I wanted. So we ended up compromising. I said, okay, how about we start off at the salary that you can offer right now, and in 6 months, and I want this in writing in my contract, in 6 months, if I'm performing better than expected, that we will renegotiate my salary and it will be bumped up to X dollars that I actually need. And they put that in the contract, right? So those are things you can ask for, but you know, until you ask, you don't know what you're going to get.
Well, and like you said, make sure you get it in writing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If anyone's hesitant to put something in writing, it's because it's not going to happen.
And that's exactly right. I had a verbal contract with the guy, and when it came to me going, okay, you said, he went, no, I didn't.
Yeah.
I went, yeah, you did, because it's the only reason I stayed.
Yeah, I also was. There was a great guy. I mean, he seemed really great. I got involved in this business partnership, and he basically told me, even though we wanted to drop a contract, you know, something that really spells everything out. You know, he just said he likes to do business on a handshake. I said, that's not going to fly. Like I need some assurances. You should have your own assurances. Let's hash this out and make sure everything's put out. And I'm really glad I did, because man, you can get so screwed over if there's a verbal argument.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
If there's a verbal agreement, having something in paper written, it's just way more
sad
foolproof.
Reflection on where humanity has gone, isn't it? Because it used to be like, like
they're not good for their word.
Meant something.
It meant something,
right? Well, and now it doesn't seem to mean much to anyone, really.
Well, I mean, think about it. Back in the day, your word meant something to the 10 people in the community. Right?
But I think it's like a reflection of who you are and how you feel about yourself. Because if you're going to put your word out there and then you renege on it, right? Like that's, your own character. You can't feel very strongly about who you are and be okay with doing that, right? And that's why it was such an important thing. My word is my bond, because that meant I'm proud and strong in who I am, and I know my own mind to say that if I make a decision, I can stick to it.
Absolutely.
Well, and those around you could at least say that, you say that, and now you're right.
Well, yeah, that's a good reflection of that person's character,
Yep.
right? They're true to their word. You just don't get that too often anymore, which I think is a shame.
I know, hey, God.
Yeah. And on that note, being true to their word,
that's of us on this podcast, and now we're down to 3. So
yeah, I think that's a great place to end there. Be true to your word. If you're gonna say that you're gonna do something, then make sure that you're gonna frickin' do it. Right.
Well, and realistically, if part of you is going, I don't want to do that, then just don't.
Then don't do it.
I mean,
yeah, it's better just to say no. It's okay to say no.
Yeah.
And that's another, I think that's part of this whole job conversation, just to throw this in at the end here, is learn to say no, and learn that, if this company doesn't value you, someone else will.
Absolutely.
Right. And realistically, you're worth more probably than what this company is valuing you at. And you should learn to trust yourself. And yeah.
Yeah.
That would be my advice. Right.
Okay.
Like if you
to
think
end it on a cheesy note, be of value to yourself.
Good one, Kristin. Good one.
I like that.
Okay.
So just I drop the disco
quotes.
Yeah. And I will say to the audience, if you want to be of value to us, you can make sure you subscribe to this show in your favorite podcast app of choice. We have audio and video available in whatever platform you prefer to use, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. We're available everywhere. TuneIn and Stitcher and Amazon, pretty much everywhere. This show is also available on YouTube. Some of you might be watching it now. It's The Subvert. You can just pop that into your search and subscribe to make sure you get every new episode every week. We actually release twice a week, so Tuesdays and Thursdays. We always keep the content flowing here, try to keep the conversation going, and hopefully you feel a little bit smarter. I don't think we're doing our job well if you feel a little dumber after this. Hopefully that's not happening.
Don't throw that out there. Jeez.
Don't plant that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you want to get in touch with us, we do encourage comments, so please let us know what you like, what you don't like. Maybe a topic suggestion. What do you want us to talk about in the future? Just drop the comments below here. We're on Twitter at the Subvert Pod, and under the same name on Facebook and Instagram as well. All right, that's all the time we have for this week. We'll see you next time.